Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me here tonight, just before you drift off to sleep. Tonight, I have something truly special for you, a gentle, magical tale from a faraway kingdom where beards weren't just facial hair, but symbols of memory, wisdom, and identity. The tale of the measured beard is a soothing epic full of soft rebellion, ancient scrolls, quiet songs, and a young boy named Edmund who dares to remember what the world tried to forget. If you enjoy these kinds of calming bedtime stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps more dreamers like you find their way here. Now, I hope this tale brings you peace, warmth, and a long, restful night of sleep. So go ahead, get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our story. In a forgotten fold of time, where history murmured like a lullaby in the breeze, there lay the quiet kingdom of Velhart, a land wrapped in the softest hills and bathed in gentle twilight. The sun never seemed to shine too brightly, nor did the wind ever howl too fiercely. Everything in Velhart moved with the rhythm of a slow, drowsy heart, as if the land itself was always half asleep, dreaming old dreams and telling older tales. The kingdom had once been known for its fragrant lavender fields, woolly sheep, and cobblestone roads that led to nowhere in particular. But above all, Velhart was known far and wide and sometimes in disbelief for one curious law. No beard shall grow past the breadth of a ripe plum, nor shrink shorter than the length of a sparrow's tail. And it was not a jest. In Velhart, this law was as sacred as stone, passed down from the days of High King Aldrich the Even-Handed, whose own beard, it was said, had been trimmed by the gods. Any man who dared let his beard grow wilder than the measure or trim it too close would be summoned before the council of comb and scissors. And there, amid ancient scrolls and trembling barbers, his fate would be decided. But to understand how such a gentle land became ruled by such a strange decree, one must go back many winters, to the days when the mountains still whispered to the sky, and rivers sang lullabies to the earth. Among the emerald hills at the edge of Velhart lived a boy named Edmund Weaver, the youngest son of a humble wool dyer. Edmund was a soft-spoken child, round in the cheek and wide in the eyes, who loved two things beyond measure: stories and beards. While other boys ran through fields or tried to catch the whispers of pixies near the orchard, Edmund would sit by his grandfather's knee and listen to tales of ancient kings with silver-threaded whiskers and wizards whose beards coiled like smoke around their staffs. His grandfather, old Bram, had the longest, softest, and wisest beard in all the valley. It shimmered like a gray waterfall and smelled faintly of pine, honey, and lavender, a scent that never failed to soothe Edmund into dreams. "Mark my words, boy," Bram would murmur, twirling a braid of his beard with gnarled fingers. "There's more wisdom in a good beard than in all the books in the royal tower, and more truth in the way a beard grows than in the tongue of a nobleman." Edmund would nod solemnly, as if hearing a sacred spell. But not all shared Bram's reverence for the beard, especially not the royal stewards who roamed the kingdom in search of unlawful follicles. For in Velhart, beard inspectors were as common as milkmaids, and their measuring ribbons hung from belts beside scrolls of fines and parchment warrants. These inspectors, draped in navy tunics with golden buttons shaped like combs, were feared by many and admired by few. It was said they carried golden scissors that never dulled, and mirrors that could see your beard from the inside. One fateful morning, as mist curled through the valley like sleepy cats, a bell tolled 3 times from the village square. The sound was gentle, but it carried weight. Everyone paused, shepherds paused mid-step, children mid-laughter. Even the birds held their breath. It was the trimmer's call, a royal summons. Old Bram, who had not left his cottage in months, stirred from his chair by the hearth. He set down his teacup with a soft clink and, slowly, pulled on his boots. Edmund watched, confusion and worry knotting in his chest. "Where are you going, grandfather?" he asked, rising to follow him. Bram simply touched his beard and smiled. But it was a sad smile, the kind that knew things young hearts should not yet carry. "To see if there's still room in this world for wisdom that grows wild," he said quietly. In the square, a small crowd had gathered, heads bowed and murmuring concern. The beard inspectors stood in a crescent formation, their eyes fixed on Bram as he walked slowly toward them, beard trailing behind like a royal robe. One of them, thin-faced and pinched, named Inspector Halgren, unrolled his ribbon. "Elder Bram," he announced in a voice that fluttered with too much pride, "your beard exceeds the sacred measure by 3 finger breadths. You are in violation of Law 27B. The townsfolk gasped, as if the wind itself had slapped them. Bram nodded slowly. "And if I trim it, will the kingdom sleep better tonight?" Halgren stiffened. "The law is not made to bring sleep, sir. It is made to bring order." Bram turned and met the eyes of his grandson in the crowd. "Then perhaps, someday, there will be a law made for dreams." With that, the inspectors raised their silver shears, and in one solemn, swift movement, cut the beard of Bram. That night, Edmund could not sleep. He crept from his bed, wrapped in his woolen shawl, and stood before the fire, where the last strands of his grandfather's beard lay curled like fallen feathers. He gathered them gently, placed them in a silk pouch, and whispered a promise. "I'll grow a beard so long the stars will envy it. And I'll change this law, grandfather, someday." Outside, the wind stirred the lavender fields with a voice like an old lullaby. And so began the quiet journey of a boy who loved stories and beards. Spring passed softly through the valley of Velhart, brushing the hills with green velvet and waking dandelions like lazy suns on the fields. Birds returned from their distant dreams, and the sheep wore coats thick with wool and boredom. But within the walls of the Weaver household, something had changed, something quiet, like the space left behind after a beloved song ends. Edmund did not speak of the beard-cutting day. No one did. The villagers, kind as they were, kept their words tucked behind pursed lips, and nodded with polite sorrow whenever old Bram walked past, his chin now as bare as a newborn apple. But Edmund noticed how their eyes lingered longer than they should, how the old men reached up to touch their own beards and thought twice about their length. The law, it seemed, had grown teeth, and yet, while others trimmed their beards with trembling fingers and called it respect for order, Edmund carried rebellion in silence, in the shape of a small silk pouch hidden beneath his tunic. Inside were the clipped strands of his grandfather's beard, each one curled delicately, like ancient script, gray and silver and white, smelling faintly of pine and lavender. He would sometimes open the pouch, late at night, under the blankets, and imagine they whispered to him, telling tales of the old kings who had ruled not with fear, but with laughter and song and beards as wild as moonlight. "Why do you carry those old things?" his mother once asked gently, having caught him gazing into the pouch beside the hearth. "They're not old things," Edmund said firmly. "They're a promise." She did not press further. Perhaps she, too, remembered a time when laws were gentler, and beards were stories told in strands. One overcast afternoon, Edmund wandered toward the old abbey ruins, beyond the western ridge, a place children were warned to avoid for its haunted stones and muttering owls. But Edmund had long learned that places adults feared often held the best secrets. The abbey stood like a forgotten poem, crumbling walls draped in ivy, arched windows through which the sky peered curiously, and a well at the center, dry for 100 years. He liked to sit there, feet dangling into the silence, imagining that the stones remembered things even the royal scribes had long since forgotten. It was here, on the 6th afternoon of his visits, that he found the book. It was tucked behind a collapsed altar, beneath a slab of moss-covered granite. Bound in cracked leather and sealed with a clasp of rusted iron, the book was heavy, as if it held not just pages, but truth. Its title, read in faded gold, The Follicular Codex, Secrets of the Bearded Realms. Edmund's breath caught. Inside, the ink had bled in places, and some pages had long since returned to dust. But what remained was wondrous. It told of ancient lands, where beards were sacred runes, where wisdom and courage were measured not in gold, but in the length of one's whiskers. It spoke of the Order of the Bristleborn, guardians of the last wild laws, who believed that beards were nature's way of marking dreamers and rebels. The Codex warned of kingdoms that had fallen into ruin only after they tried to tame the beard, shaving it too short or taxing it too long. Edmund closed the book slowly, heart thudding like a distant drum. He looked around the ruins, and for the first time, they did not seem broken, only dormant. That night, he returned home under the hush of moonlight. He tucked the codex beneath his mattress and slept with the silk pouch clutched in his hand. The next morning, he stopped trimming the soft hairs that had begun to bloom upon his chin. "Your face looks fuzzy," his older brother teased. "It's history growing back," Edmund replied simply. Seasons passed. Edmund grew, not just taller or wiser, but different. While other boys sharpened blades or carved whistles from branches, Edmund learned to braid beards and mix oils from lavender, nettle, and birch bark. He read the codex again and again, until its words bloomed in his dreams. He began visiting older villagers, the ones who remembered the days before the law, and asked for their stories. In barns, bakeries, and beneath willow trees, he gathered whispers of the last great beard gathering, a festival long outlawed, where men wove ribbons and feathers into their beards and sang songs to the sky. Some laughed when he asked about it. Some wept, but all remembered. And with each story, Edmund's pouch of whiskers felt heavier, not with hair, but with purpose. On his 15th birthday, Edmund stood before his grandfather with the codex in one hand, and his beard now long enough to brush his collar swaying in the summer breeze. Old Bram, older now and quiet as the morning mist, placed a calloused hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Is this the road you'll walk, then?" he asked softly. "It's the one that grew beneath me," Edmund replied. There was no grand speech, no glowing light, just a quiet nod from a man who had once lost his beard, and a silent vow from a boy who would bring back its meaning. And somewhere, deep within the dry well of the abbey, a wind stirred gently, as if the stones were waking. By the time Edmund Weaver turned 16, his name had begun to circulate in hushed tones throughout the valley of Velhart, not in fear, nor in scandal, but in curiosity, as if the wind itself was unsure whether to whisper or cheer. The villagers had started to notice, not just the beard which now fell to his chest in soft chestnut waves, lightly braided with twin strands like the stories of old, but the way he listened, the way he asked questions no one else dared. "Do you remember what the great gathering was like? What did it feel like to grow your beard however you pleased? Did people really sing into their beards at sunset? And even more boldly, do you ever wonder why the law was made?" These were not questions one asked aloud, not under the watch of the royal trimmers, whose patrols had grown more frequent, nor with the threat of co-audits that now came every full moon. It was said they used enchanted calipers that could detect illegal follicles in complete darkness. But Edmund, armed with his grandfather's wisdom and the follicular codex, had grown braver. He'd memorized the lengths of ancient styles, the moonfall curl, the warden's tusk, and the feared serpent's fork, which had once adorned the chin of a prince who rode a bear into battle. He learned oils and herbs to encourage healthy growth, combed his beard each morning while murmuring old rhymes from the codex, and most importantly, he shared what he learned. It began with a small group of friends: the blacksmith's son, the baker's apprentice, 2 shepherd boys, and an older tailor who still remembered the scent of the last gathering. They met in secret, beneath the bell tower of the abandoned grain mill, bringing with them oil flasks, plucked thistle roots, beard chalk, and whispers of old songs. They called themselves the Braided Truth. They weren't rebels, not yet. They were dreamers. and dreamers are dangerous enough in a land that fears change. Each gathering was quiet, reverent. They would share beard lore from their families, trade trimming techniques based on the lunar cycle, and attempt to translate more from the brittle pages of the codex. One cold evening, as the wind howled like a lonely flute through the shingles, Edmund stood before his friends and unrolled a long, frayed tapestry. Upon it were portraits the old kings of Velhart, as painted in temple archives, their beards majestic and proud. He had found it hidden behind a crumbling shelf in the abbey, wrapped around a broken broomstick. "Look at them," Edmund whispered. "These were the rulers before the law of length. Do they look ashamed of their beards?" "No," the blacksmith's son murmured. "They look alive." Word spread faster than they hoped. One of the boys, young and eager, told his cousin in a moment of foolish pride. The cousin told the merchant. The merchant, perhaps hoping for favor, told a royal trimmer. And 3 days later, just as Edmund was preparing an herbal oil blend, he heard a knock. Not a gentle knock, a summons knock. Inspector Halgren stood at the door, boots polished, ribbon measure coiled at his side like a serpent. His expression was the same pinched smirk that Edmund remembered from his grandfather's trial. "Master Weaver," Halgren said, voice clipped and sour, "it has come to the attention of the Royal Registry that you have violated the statute of controlled follicles. You are summoned to appear for assessment." Behind him stood 2 guards and a man in crimson robes, a beard court scribe. They did not wait for an answer. Edmund's mother pleaded. His brother scowled. But old Bram, though visibly shaken, simply helped Edmund fasten the pouch of whiskers beneath his tunic. "You carry more than strands, boy," he said softly. "You carry remembrance." At the courthouse, the chamber was quiet, save for the scratching of the scribe's quill. A great gilded chair sat empty upon the dais, a relic from the days of High King Aldrich. Behind it, a tapestry bore the motto, "Order before ornament." Halgren stepped forward and unfurled his ribbon measure. "Subject's beard, 11 inches, forked and woven with braids. Styling violates section 42. C. Beard forms that imply divergence or symbolism shall not exceed 10 inches. He paused, savoring the silence. "Do you contest this, Master Weaver?" Edmund stepped forward, voice steady despite the thunder in his chest. "Yes," he said, "I do." Gasps echoed like soft raindrops on stone. No one ever contested the measure. Halgren blinked. "On what grounds?" Edmund reached inside his tunic and drew forth the codex. "This is the original beard lore of Velhart. It predates Law 27b. It speaks of a time when the beard was a sacred trust, a reflection of spirit and soul. I present it, not as rebellion, but as remembrance." He paused. "And I ask, when did we forget?" The courtroom held its breath. Even the scribe's quill stopped. For a moment, it seemed as if the walls themselves listened. Halgren's face twisted in distaste. This book is not sanctioned, nor are your tales of ancient dreamers." He motioned to the guards. "Seize the codex, and prepare the subject for trimming." But as they stepped forward, a voice called out. It was the tailor one of the braided truth. Then the blacksmith's son, then the baker's apprentice. They stood one by one from the gallery. Some old, some young, beards long and short, but eyes steady. "We remember, we remember." The guards hesitated. For the first time, Halgren's scissors trembled, and in the hush that followed, Edmund smiled. He may not have won the law. Not yet, but he had awakened something older than rules, a story returning to itself. That night, the stars above Velhart shone brighter than usual, or so it seemed to those who dared look up. And in the quiet valley below, word of what had happened in the courthouse spread like candlelight passed from hand to hand. Some called it foolishness, others heresy. But in hushed kitchens and behind shuttered windows, more than a few whispered the same words with trembling hearts. We remember. Edmund was not imprisoned, nor was he punished, not openly. The Beard Court declared that due to unusual circumstances and emotional agitation among the citizenry, the trimming would be postponed for reflection. The codex, however, was confiscated, sealed in the vault of compliance, where forbidden items were kept behind brass doors and watched by silent guards with ink-stained gloves. But Edmund left the courtroom with his beard intact, and perhaps, more importantly, with a spark that had now leapt from him to others. That spark would not fade easily. In the days that followed, something shifted in the way the town of Glimmerglen and the whole of Velhart breathed. At the market, old men began stroking their chins thoughtfully, letting their whiskers grow just a little longer. In the bakeries, flour-dusted apprentices began twisting tiny braids into the ends of their stubble. Even the milkmaid down the hill, who had never cared for facial hair, found herself humming an old tavern tune that began with, "A beard once curled round wisdom's gate." The braided truth no longer met in secret. They moved their gatherings to the Lavender Hollow, a shaded grove behind the monastery ruins, where the sun filtered through the branches like threads of golden hair. There, they sang songs from the Codex, what they remembered of it, and shared stories, not of war or conquest, but of freedom in expression, dignity in natural growth, and the simple joy of not being afraid to be oneself. Edmund became something of a gentle leader, not with titles or decrees, but by example. He never demanded loyalty. He only asked one question, again and again. "What does your beard say about you?" And in that question, many found something they didn't know they'd lost. But the royal trimmers had not forgotten. Inspector Halgren, though humiliated by the courtroom scene, remained vigilant, sharpening his golden scissors daily, watching from afar. Reports reached him of boys tying feathers to their chin hairs, of shepherds refusing comb audits, of an elderly woman knitting tiny beard covers for village festivals. Halgren took it as personal offense. "This is no longer minor dissent," he told the royal council one foggy morning. "This is the erosion of the very fabric of control." He lobbied for harsher enforcement, citing follicular sedition and growth anarchy. Though many on the council were unsure, they agreed to grant him limited authority to monitor the village of Glimmerglen more closely. And so began what would quietly be called the quiet trimming. In the dark weeks that followed, members of the braided truth began to disappear, not violently, but subtly. One was sent to work in distant mines for economic necessity. Another was relocated to a northern lumber camp due to family transfer. A third was suddenly enlisted into the Royal Pipe Inspection Guild, a post known for its silence and its distance from any beard-friendly settlement. It was never spoken aloud, but it was understood. Edmund watched it unfold with growing sorrow. And then came the night they came for him. It was just before dawn. The lavender fields lay silver under the moon, and the crickets sang without worry. Edmund had been awake, tracing the last page of a new journal he had started, one in which he was rewriting the follicular codex from memory. The original was gone, but the words still lived in his heart. Every evening, he would record what he remembered, word by word, feeling by feeling, until the parchment sighed under the ink. He was mid-sentence. "A beard is not grown to defy, but to declare," when the knock came. Not a single knock this time. 3. Quick, firm. He stood, calm but alert, and opened the door. Halgren was there, alone. His eyes gleamed with something not quite satisfaction, but hunger. "Come," he said. "The council has changed its mind." Edmund nodded. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply placed the pouch of whiskers, the same one he had carried for years, over his head and let it rest against his chest like a medal. He turned to his grandfather, who had risen quietly behind him, pale and trembling. "You don't have to," Bram began, but Edmund raised a hand. "I do," he said softly. "Not because they demand it, but because the story must go where the silence waits. They marched him down the cobblestone road toward the old measurement dais near the village square. The crowd was smaller than last time, not out of indifference, but fear. Halgren unrolled the ribbon. This time, there would be no court, no speeches, no protest. Only shears. Edmund closed his eyes as the silver blades rose, reflecting the soft blush of dawn. And then, a voice, not one of protest, not of anger, but of song, soft, ancient, a lullaby from the codex. Another voice joined, then another, until dozens, perhaps hundreds, was singing. The royal trimmer paused. His hand trembled. Edmund opened his eyes. The villagers stood with candles, with ribbons in their pockets, with tiny braids tucked behind their ears, not out of rebellion but remembrance. He smiled. Even as the shears made their cut neat and silent, Edmund smiled, because he understood then the beard could be trimmed, but the story could not. And from the strands that fell that morning, 1,000 new beards would rise, and with them, the whisper of a kingdom slowly remembering how to dream again. The spring that followed Edmund's trimming came with strange warmth. The kind of warmth that didn't just melt frost from rooftops or coax blossoms from stubborn soil, but the kind that woke something. Something old, something quiet, something waiting. It started not with a shout or a banner, but with a song. A simple tune hummed low by a girl threading needles at the tailor's window. A melody that drifted across cobblestones and over garden walls. It carried in the hush of marketplaces and between the cracks of bakery ovens, blooming like lavender between stone. The song had no name, but it had words. A beard once curled round wisdom's gate, but scissors stole its golden fate. Yet still it grows where hearts are true, and braids itself in all we do. No one knew where it came from, but everyone knew why it was sung. In the quiet hills beyond Glimmerglen, Edmund walked alone. His beard, once proud and braided, now barely touched his collar. The silver shears of Inspector Hallgren had done their work, yet the wound was not on his face, it was in his memory. But even that, like earth after fire, had begun to sprout something new. He still carried the pouch, now containing 2 sets of whiskers, his grandfather's and his own. He still rewrote the codex each morning, now onto longer scrolls sewn together from parchment scraps and stitched with green thread. He called it the Ember Edition because it did not burn, but glowed softly, waiting to be fanned. And he still dreamed, but now his dreams took the shape of movement. One morning, while picking rosemary sprigs behind the chapel ruins, Edmund met someone unexpected. A woman. She looked about 30 taller than him, dressed in muted browns with travel-stained boots and a leather satchel bearing the sigil of a crow inside a ring of vines. Her hair was shaved on one side and braided on the other, and her eyes were the clear blue of mountain snow. "Edmund Weaver?" she asked without ceremony. He blinked. "Yes, I've walked 3 days to find you. They call me Marin." She reached into her satchel and pulled free a folded piece of wool. Within it, tucked carefully, was a single page from the follicular codex, old, yellowed, but real. Edmund gasped. "Where did you find this?" Marin shrugged. "The codex never truly dies. It just travels." She knelt beside him, her voice low. "We heard what happened in Glimmerglen. The songs made their way to the old circle, the Council of Shearless Lands." Edmund stared. "I thought that was just legend." Marin smiled. "So did most of us. Until we decided not to be." Marin explained that beyond Velhart's mountains, past the iron rivers and forests of blue fir, there were still pockets of people who lived by the old lore. They called themselves the Circle, and they had watched the changes in Velhart with growing interest. "Your protest," Marin said, "was the first time in 50 years that someone challenged the beard law publicly and walked away still singing." Edmund looked down at his hands. "But I failed. My beard was still cut." Marin's voice softened. "But your story wasn't." She unrolled a map, hand-drawn, beautiful, filled with curling script and small dots of golden ink. Each dot was a sanctuary, a gathering of quiet rebels, scholars, barbers in hiding, and lore-keepers who had kept the memory of the beard alive not just as facial hair, but as philosophy. "We're not asking you to fight," she said. "We're asking you to teach." Edmund's heart stirred. Marin reached into her satchel again, this time drawing out a small silver comb ancient, engraved with the crest of the Bristleborn Order. "This belonged to someone like you once," she said. "A man named Elric Thorn. He led the first calling long before the laws were written. Now, we believe the time has come for a second calling." They left 2 days later, just before dawn. Edmund packed little. His journal, the pouch, a bottle of beard oil, and a piece of lavender from his mother. She didn't say goodbye with tears. She simply touched his cheek and whispered, "Follow the root, not the flower." Old Bram gave him his cloak, frayed and warm, lined with combs sewn into the hem. "I lost my beard," the old man said, voice hoarse with memory. "But not my grandson." As they journeyed north, Marin and Edmund passed through villages asleep in the shadow of fear. Some welcomed them with caution, others with silent meals and furtive glances. A few chased them off with pitchforks, yelling, "No beards, no songs, no sedition." But in every place, they left behind a thread, a story, a laugh, a simple lesson from the Ember edition. "Measure not the beard," Edmund would say, standing before curious listeners, "but the soul it shelters." Soon, other travelers began to meet them along the road. A mason from Bramblegate with a beard hidden in his collar. A potter woman from the east who grew a ceremonial chin plate in private. A pair of twins who played beard ballads on hammered dulcimers. They joined the journey. By the time they reached the Whispering Plateau, a wind-swept cliff that overlooked half the kingdom, they numbered 12. Marin called it a good sign. 12 is the number of the Bristleborn, she said. That night, around a campfire of cedar branches, Edmund unfurled his growing scroll. He read aloud from the newest passage. "Let the beard be both shield and mirror. Shield against silence. Mirror to the truth one dares not shave away." The group sat in reverent quiet. The fire cracked like old knuckles. Above them, the stars watched and listened, because somewhere deep in the kingdom's bones, the beard was beginning to grow again. By the time summer tipped its golden fingers into the valleys of northern Velhart, Edmund and his quiet company had grown into something more than a group. They were becoming a caravan, not of merchants or pilgrims, but of rememberers. They did not carry silks or spices, but tales and teachings. Where they walked, stories followed. Where they lingered, old songs stirred. And behind them trailed whispers, like the wind had begun to speak again in a forgotten tongue. The people began calling them the Ember Caravan. It was meant as a nickname, a casual jest whispered by a barley farmer in the town of Penridge. But the name stuck because it felt right. They were not flames. They were embers, soft, glowing, persistent. The kind of fire that didn't burn cities, but lit hearths. In Penridge, they held their first public gathering. It took place beneath the shade of 3 willow trees near the edge of the village. The caravan laid down blankets, lit a small ceremonial brazier, and invited anyone curious to listen. They spoke not of rebellion, nor politics, but of history forgotten. Marin recited a passage from her recovered page of the Codex, while Edmund braided a local boy's beard into the style of the wind twist, an ancient Velhart pattern once worn by scholars. The villagers were hesitant at first, watching from afar. But when Edmund offered beard balm scented with clove and mint free of charge, even the stern miller leaned closer. By dusk, half the village had joined them, and someone had brought a fiddle. A fire was lit, bread was shared, laughter sparked. For one night, it was as if the law of beard measurement had never existed. That same evening, a quiet boy named Tom approached Edmund. He was small for his age, no older than 10, with cheeks round as peaches and eyes too old for his face. "My father's beard was taken last year," Tom whispered. "He cried. I never saw him cry before that." Edmund kneaded. "I'm sorry, Tom." The boy reached into a satchel and pulled out a tiny braid of hair, carefully tied with twine. "I saved this," he said. "I keep it under my pillow. Mama says it's silly." Edmund shook his head gently. "It's not silly. It's sacred." He gave Tom a ribbon dyed green and gold, and showed him how to tie the braid to his walking stick. "Now it walks with you," Edmund said, "and every step you take is part of its story." The boy beamed, and something glowed behind his eyes. It hadn't glowed in a long time, but as the caravan grew warmer, the kingdom grew colder. Inspector Halgren, though stationed still in Glimmerglen, had not lost sight of the Ember caravan's path. He received reports from traveling merchants, suspicious barbers, and informants planted in taverns. They spoke of whispered songs in public gatherings. They spoke of hope being passed hand to hand. And that, Halgren knew, was more dangerous than swords. He wrote directly to the Royal Council. "The boy weaver spreads not rebellion, but remembrance. And if we do not extinguish remembrance, we may soon find ourselves ruled by it." The council, cautious but reluctant to appear heavy-handed again, authorized Halgren to send out Mirror Riders' agents dressed in gray with mirrored visors and silent horses, tasked not to arrest, but to observe, track, and report. "They carry no blades," Halgren told them. "Only mirrors, because what they reflect shall condemn." 3 days north of Penridge, the caravan entered a region known as the Crooked Hills, a land of sloping ridges and meadows where wild herbs grew untamed. There, they found a village abandoned. Houses stood intact, tools rusted in place, hearths filled with cold ash but no voices, no footprints, no laughter. It was eerie. "This was Rindal," Marin whispered. "It used to hold the Great Comb Festival each autumn. Then came the royal inspections. People left rather than submit." In the center of the empty square stood a stone statue, cracked and weathered, but still proud. It depicted a man with a massive beard, both arms raised in song. At his feet, etched in curling script, "Here we grew without shame." They lit a lantern beneath the statue that night and sat in silence. Then Edmund, unprompted, began to hum. The melody was soft, ancient one he had dreamed once, but never sung aloud. One by one, the others joined. No one spoke, no one taught. They simply remembered through breath and note, and above them, the wind whispered like a mother, returning to a cradle. Later that night, Edmund awoke to find Marin sitting beside the lantern. She was staring into the flame, expression distant. "Something's coming," she said without turning. Edmund sat beside her. "Halgren? Perhaps. Or something worse." She turned toward him now, her face illuminated by flickering gold. "You understand this isn't just about beards, don't you?" Edmund nodded slowly. "It's about memory." She nodded. "It's about a people remembering what it means to belong to themselves. Not to laws, not to measurements, but to their own stories." She placed a hand over his. "Be careful, Edmund. Because those who forget will fear you, and those who remember will follow you. Both are dangerous." He didn't sleep after that. He simply watched the flame until morning, whispering the words of the codex to himself like a prayer. "A trimmed beard may yield to shears, but the soul beneath does not fray." At dawn, they left Rindal behind. The lantern beneath the statue burned low but steady, as if unwilling to give up its post. Edmund looked back once, hand resting over the pouch beneath his cloak, and whispered a promise. "We'll come back when voices return." They moved east, tracing old shepherd trails through misty thickets and valleys stitched with fog. The land seemed to breathe differently now, the silence heavier, the bird song more hesitant, like the earth itself sensed what followed behind. Because something did. The Mirror Riders first appeared 2 nights later. They made no sound, no declaration. No one knew where they slept or how they moved. But always, Just beyond the edge of firelight, a glint would catch the eye, a flash of cold reflection between the trees. Their armor bore no crest. Their visors showed no face. But what they mirrored, they remembered. And what they remembered, they reported. At the village of Lomrest, the Ember Caravan found warm bread and cautious smiles. The town elders, two gray-haired sisters, named Vera and Jun, welcomed them into the old meeting barn. Though they asked no questions aloud, they placed flowers beneath the benches and left tiny combs carved of cherry wood by the hearth. That night, Edmund spoke softly of courage wrapped in kindness, of heritage not dictated by decree. He passed around a page from the Ember edition, and with it a memory. My grandfather's beard was clipped by law, but his laughter was never trimmed, nor was the love I carry still. That's what no ribbon can measure. The audience sat in reverent silence, but outside, beyond the lanterns, a horse exhaled. A gray figure watched. In the morning, Vera met Edmund at the well. "They came last week," she said, gazing toward the tree line. "Who?" he asked. The riders in glass didn't speak, just stared, as if waiting for us to flinch. Edmund frowned. "Did you?" She smiled, slow and wrinkled. "I gave them tea and tied a beard ribbon around their saddle. Let them figure that out." She handed him a small parcel wrapped in linen. "For the road," she said. "And remember, not all who ride in silence ride alone. Some remember, even beneath the mirror." The caravan moved on through fir groves and across high ridges where sheep grazed like clouds fallen to earth. Their numbers had grown, from 12 to 23. Some had joined after hearing the songs. Others had followed whispers, tracking the scent of clove oil and hope. There were artists and bakers, stonemasons, and a former palace footman who now kept his beard in a pouch, waiting for a safer time to grow it again. They were not warriors. They were weavers of memory, of meaning, of quiet revolt. And they carried no weapons, only stories. But even stories cast shadows. In the village of Holomir, where the river ran black with peat and lanterns floated in bowls on festival nights, the caravan was met with locked doors and shuttered stalls. Children peeked out with wide eyes, but no one waved. Marin frowned. This place wasn't always like this. They set camp on the outskirts, beneath a stone bridge, and held no gathering that night. Just a shared meal, a few low songs, and the rustling of Edmund's quill on parchment. It was late when the stones began to fall. Not many, just 3, but enough. One struck their bread pot. Another landed near the fire. The third hit Edmund's scroll. He jumped back, startled, while the others rose quickly, not in fear, but in practiced calm. No one shouted. No one needed to. A voice called from the darkness, low, measured, without rage, but firm. "Go back the way you came. We remember too. And some memories should stay buried." Marin stood. "We don't come to stir unrest, only to remind." Another stone clattered near her boot. "You've reminded enough," the voice replied. "Now let us forget in peace." They did not respond. They simply packed quietly. At sunrise, they left Holomir with a sadness heavier than their satchels. That afternoon, Edmund sat alone on a stump at the forest's edge, staring at the scroll, a tear in the page, a black mark from soot, and above it, the line he'd written the night before. "Truth doesn't always need a torch. Sometimes it waits in the dark, whispering." He heard steps behind him. It was Marin. She crouched, picking up the torn page. "They're afraid," she said. "Not of us, but of remembering what it felt like before the loss." Edmund nodded. "What if we're just hurting them more?" Marin looked at him carefully. "You're not forcing them to remember. You're simply making forgetting harder." She handed him the page. "Even embers can sting," she said. "But better to feel the burn of truth than the cold of silence." That night, Edmund did not sing. He sat by the fire, listening instead to the wind, the breath of the trees, the rustle of those who still dared to gather. One of the newer members, a quiet man named Alder, pulled out a flute carved from birchwood. He played a tune Edmund had never heard. It was slow, wandering, gentle, like something half-remembered from a dream you'd forgotten you dreamed. Others hummed softly. No words, no message, just memory. And from the trees, where mirrored figures once stood, no reflection came, only silence. A silence that sounded different this time. Not oppressive, but listening. The next village was called Fenrest, a place so small it didn't appear on most maps, nestled between a mossy ravine and an orchard that bore pears the size of a man's fist. It wasn't fear that greeted the Ember caravan there. It was exhaustion. The villagers didn't turn them away, nor did they welcome them with songs or braids. They simply observed, curious, quiet, like people watching rain after a long drought, and not knowing whether to dance or run for shelter. The caravan set up camp in the old sheepfold. No one protested. No one smiled. That evening, Edmund walked alone along the orchard's edge, watching the last sunlight drip through the branches. His thoughts felt like leaves after a storm, damp, tangled, not yet settled. So much had happened in so few moons, from Glimmerglen to Hollowmere, from whispered songs to silent riders. And now this numbness, not resistance, not rebellion, just a world unsure of whether to feel again. Was that worse? He sat beneath a pear tree and unrolled the scroll. The ink caught the dying light. He reread one of his early passages, words written when his beard had just begun to regrow. If you trim a tree for fear it may grow wild, you rob it of fruit it hasn't yet dreamed of bearing. He smiled faintly, and then he noticed something. A figure just across the orchard. A girl, perhaps 10 or 11, perched on a crooked branch. She wasn't hiding, just watching. Her chin rested in her palms, legs swinging. Edmund raised a hand in gentle greeting. She didn't wave back, but after a moment she did call out, "Is it true your beard used to touch your chest?" Edmund blinked, then laughed. "It did. Why'd you let them cut it?" "I didn't let them," he said softly. "They just did it anyway." She thought about that. Then, "Will you grow it back?" "Yes," Edmund said. "Not for me. For someone I loved." She stared for a moment more, then climbed down and vanished between the trees, leaving no name. But somehow, Edmund didn't feel alone anymore. Back at camp, a stir had begun to ripple through the group. Marin stood in the center, a folded piece of gray parchment in her hands, the kind used only by the Royal Council and its agents. No ink marked it, no seal, but all present knew what it meant. It was a silent summons, a form of message older than Law 1 that meant, "You are seen. You are awaited. You are not yet condemned, but neither are you safe." "How did it arrive?" Edmund asked. "It was tucked beneath a tin plate near the well," Alder replied. "No one saw who placed it." Marin read aloud the short, etched words that shimmered faintly like heat on stone. "To the boy with a pouch of whiskers, the council has questions. If you believe in the story you carry, come tell it in full. Bring none but the truth and those who remember it. We await you in the Hollow Hall." The Hollow Hall, a place few had seen, and even fewer returned from. Located within the mountain citadel of Almscliff, the hall was said to be where the laws of Velhart were carved, not with quills, but with chisels, into the bones of stone itself. "It's a trap," one traveler said. "Or a test," said another. But Edmund didn't hesitate. He looked at the letter, then at his scroll, and said quietly, "I'll go." The next day, only 6 would travel with him, including Marin, Alder, and Tom, the quiet boy with the braid on his staff. The rest would remain, continuing the caravan's work across the valleys, keeping the songs alive, like 1,000 small torches in the dark. Before they left, Vera and June from Loamrest returned, having traveled to find them after hearing of the summons. They brought with them an old wooden box. Inside, wrapped in velvet, lay a bronze badge shaped like a curled lock of hair, the symbol of the Forgotten Order of the Bristleborn. "This was meant to be worn by those who defended not the beard, but the memory behind it," Jun said. "We kept it hidden all these years, but it belongs to the story now." Edmund accepted it with trembling fingers. He wore it not upon his chest, but upon his scroll, fastening it through the parchment like a clasp. That night, as the wind whispered down from the northern peaks, Edmund sat before the fire and read from his latest entry. Stories do not march in armor. They do not shout down halls or take up steel, but they endure. Because a story, remembered, becomes a law unbroken, even when written only in the quiet of the heart. The fire cracked softly. A feather drifted from the sky. Someone, far off, began to hum the braid song again. But now, there was a harmony beneath it. Deeper, older. It came from the trees, from the roots, from the road ahead. The road to Almscliff was not marked on any map. It wound through the stonewood, where the trees grew from cracks in the granite, and the roots coiled like sleeping serpents beneath the moss. Birds did not sing there. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But Edmund led onward, 6 companions behind him, a scroll at his side, a pouch of whiskers beneath his tunic, and a bronze badge fastening them together like history sewn into flesh. No one spoke much. Even Marin, so quick with laughter and thought, kept her voice low, as if wary of awakening something slumbering in the mountain's bones. The only sound was the crunch of boots and the soft tap of Tom's staff as it struck the rock. Each step steady and certain, the braid of his father's hair swaying with every swing. It took 3 days to reach the Gate of Echoes. Not a gate in the usual sense, but 2 massive slabs of dark stone that leaned together at the top, forming a narrow passage like the mouth of a whispering beast. Upon each slab were etched thousands of names, not of kings or warriors, but of laws. Marin brushed her fingers along a line of symbols near the base. Each law that was ever written, she murmured. Even the ones that were forgotten. Edmund paused. Even the ones they regret? Especially those. He traced one symbol that looked like a curling strand of hair crossed with a pair of shears. Beneath it, a phrase carved in the old tongue. The measure of order shall outlive the wild. His jaw tightened. Not if I have anything to say about it. Beyond the gate, the path narrowed into a canyon of silence, where even footsteps felt too loud. Moss clung to the walls like old regrets, and black birds with white eyes watched from ledges, unmoving. At sunset on the 4th day, they emerged into a great cold basin, and there, carved into the cliffs, like a forgotten cathedral, stood Almscliff. Not a castle, not a palace, but something older. It was a city of halls, arches, and vaults, all tunneled into the mountain, lit by pale glass orbs that glowed without flame. No guards stood at the entrance, no flags flew, only a single carved warning above the great lintel. Within these walls, the tongue is stone. Alder read it aloud and whispered, "This place does not ask questions, it collects answers." Inside, they were greeted not by voices, but by figures, in slate-gray robes who moved like shadows, the stewards of memory, as Marin called them. Each wore a mask made of bleached wood, with no eyes, only slits for breath. They did not bow. They did not blink. They simply led. The group was taken through long corridors where murals told the story of Velhart, in colorless relief, from the arrival of the first settlers to the rise of High King Aldrich and the foundation of the Law of Beard. One wall bore an image of a barber kneeling before a crown, scissors held like an offering. "That's the Pact of Scales," Marin said, "when the right to grow wild was surrendered in return for social harmony." Edmund stared at the scene. It looks more like surrender than harmony. At last, they reached a circular chamber, lit by blue light that spilled down from a hole high above a skylight, carved through 50 feet of stone. The floor was polished obsidian, smooth as glass. In its center stood a single chair wide, simple, impossibly old. And behind it, cut into the wall like a window into memory, stood the Council of Measure. 6 robed figures, no names, no faces, just voices, low, layered, and slow, as if spoken through water and age. A steward gestured to the chair. Edmund stepped forward. Do you bring the codex? The voices asked in unison. I bring its echo, Edmund replied, and unrolled the parchment scroll that had grown with each step of the journey. Do you claim it as truth? I claim it as remembered. The chamber fell still. One voice deeper than the others said, Memory is not proof. Stories are not law. Edmund met the wall of shadows with steady eyes. Then let me tell you what law forgets. And he did. For the better part of an hour, Edmund read not just the old texts, but his own editions, the song lines, the braid prayers, the village testimonies. He spoke of Tom's braid, of Holomere's fear, of Penridge's fiddle, of Vera's tea, and the badge passed down in velvet silence. He did not shout. He invited, and when he finished, the scroll lay on the floor like a river of thought, its ink still drying in places. The council was quiet. Then a second voice spoke higher, older. The law was born to prevent chaos. Edmund nodded, and it birthed something worse. Forgetting. Another voice. Do you propose repeal? Edmund shook his head. Not today. Murmurs rose behind the wall. Then what? He looked up. I propose a question. That stilled the room. Let the people remember the choice they were never given. Let the story be heard again. Not by stone, but by voice. Silence followed. But something shifted in the air, not a word, not a judgment. Just attention. As if the mountain itself was beginning to listen. That night, in a spare chamber, lined with combs made of iron and glass, Edmund could not sleep. He sat beneath the pale orb light, clutching the pouch of whiskers and thinking of his grandfather's fire-warmed cottage, the smell of lavender and wool, and the first time he'd ever wondered why a beard should be measured at all. A whisper came, not a ghost, not a sound, a memory, his own voice. As a child, long ago, I'll grow a beard so long the stars will envy it. He smiled, slow and tired. Perhaps not yet, but soon. And next time, he would not come alone. The next morning, Edmund awoke to a sound he hadn't heard since Glimmerglen. Scissors. Not the harsh snap of punishment, but the soft snick-snack of grooming. Precise, measured, rhythmic. He rose and followed the sound down the corridor of stone until he reached a small antechamber, lit by a single beam of sky. There, standing beside a tall silver mirror, was one of the steward's masks removed, revealing a face lined with age and peace. The man was trimming his own beard, which flowed white down his chest in smooth, careful layers. He saw Edmund and smiled. You thought we all shaved, the man said gently. Edmund blinked. E.T. Many of us did once. Some still do. But not all of us have forgotten why the law was written, or how far it's drifted. He motioned to the mirror. Sit. Edmund hesitated, then obeyed. The steward began to comb his beard, slow strokes that didn't seek to reshape, but to understand. You stood in the hollow hall yesterday and said something most have never dared think, he murmured. You didn't demand revolution. You asked for memory. Edmund looked into the mirror. Is that so dangerous? The steward's eyes met his in the glass. It is the most dangerous thing. Later that day, a parchment was slipped beneath the door of Edmund's guest chamber. Unsealed. No emblem. Just 5 words. The council has not spoken. He read it 3 times, unsure whether it meant delay, denial, or silent assent. Marin, who sat sharpening a quill nearby, glanced up. That's not a message, she said. It's a warning. Then they'll do nothing? They'll wait. Watch. And if you stir too many hearts. She tapped the parchment. They'll say you were never summoned at all. That night, they held no meeting, no official gathering, but still people come. It began with a soft knock at the chamber door. A boy of 15 stood there, nervous and pale, holding a folded cloth in both hands. Inside was a comb carved from bone, etched with a single word. Remind. I wasn't allowed to keep my father's beard, the boy said, eyes wet but proud. So I carved what I remembered of it. Edmund took the comb with reverence. He said no grand words. He simply placed it beside his scroll. An hour later, a woman came, then a potter, then a steward who left without speaking but returned an hour later with two more. Before dawn, nearly a dozen had passed through, each leaving something. A ribbon, a line of song, a torn page, a story. They did not call it a rebellion, but something had begun. Something quiet, something turning. By the fourth day, the hollow hall was humming, not with speech, but with breath. With glances, passed like secret torches, with old steward robes exchanged for gray tunics, lined with faint beard patterns. People began humming again, soft tunes from the codex, half forgotten but returning like migrating birds. The council said nothing, but everyone knew. They felt it, and they feared it. It was Tom, the youngest of the caravan, who gave the idea voice. They had gathered in a small reading vault, beneath the archives, surrounded by shelves of rolled proclamations and laws. So old, no one remembered what they enforced. Tom was sitting cross-legged, braidstick across his lap, when he asked, "Why don't we write it again?" Marin paused, mid stroke. "Write what?" "The Codex," he said. "Not just what Edmund remembers. Not just what was saved." He looked around the room, but what's still living? Silence followed. Not resistance, just surprise. Alder leaned forward. "A new Codex?" "No," Edmund said slowly. "The true Codex. Not a relic. A record. Not of what was written, but what was felt." That night, they began, not with proclamations or plans, but with stories. Each member of the caravan, and those who had come to find them in Almscliff, took turns sharing. The first time they saw someone punished for a beard, the scent of the oil their father once used, the song their grandmother hummed while braiding their uncle's whiskers, the shame they felt after trimming themselves to avoid being noticed, the guilt of never speaking out. Some cried, some laughed, some simply sat in silence, eyes closed, hands pressed over their hearts. And Edmund wrote. He didn't correct or categorize. He recorded, page after page, line after line, until the new scroll coiled beside the old one, thicker now, softer, more human. Outside the vault, the stewards who still held to the law paced more quickly. Whispers turned sharp. Lanterns were dimmed early. Even the council's chamber was sealed for 2 days. No declarations, no verdicts, only silence. But not all silence was loyal. A steward named Elswin, whose mask bore a faded knotwork sigil, approached Edmund in the corridor and whispered, "There are those within who believe the law was meant to serve people, not shape them." He passed Edmund a small satchel. Inside, 6 wax tablets, each bearing the council's internal discussions from years past arguments, dissent, even remorse. "They've hidden their own doubts," Elswin said. "But stone can only bury truth so long before roots crack it." He vanished before Edmund could thank him. And so, with each step, the weight shifted. Not loudly, not in marches or banners, but in hearts. In hands that once trimmed, now folding pages instead. In mouths that once obeyed, now humming old songs. In the hollow hall, where for centuries words were etched and forgotten, new words began to live again, not in stone, but in story. And somewhere deep within Almscliff, the mountain began to whisper, not in warning, but in remembrance. In the days that followed, the true codex grew like a vine finding cracks in an old wall. What had started as Edmund's careful recordings turned into a shared scroll, pages filled not only with lore and tradition, but with memories, questions, dreams. Each line braided with the ones before it, inked in different hands, written with uneven strokes but unwavering hearts. The parchment coiled through the reading vault like a serpent of truth, a living thing. At first, the council said nothing. They remained behind their black lacquered screen in the hollow hall, as they had for generations, their voices never rising. their presence never visible. But there were signs. The ceremonial gong, which usually rang at dawn to summon the stewards to duty, now rang at irregular hours. The book of measure, once left open at the center of the council floor, had been closed. And one day, someone noticed that the bronze bust of High King Aldrich, keeper of the first beard law, had been quietly removed from its pedestal. No one mentioned it, but everyone noticed. The caravan continued their work. Edmund, Marin, Alder, Tom, and the others met nightly with visitors who came by word of mouth, not to plot, not to defy, but simply to speak. The reading vault had become something new, not a courtroom, not a sanctuary, but a mirror, a place where people saw, perhaps for the first time in their lives, themselves not as subjects beneath law, but as threads in something ancient, beautiful, and still unfolding. Even the stewards, robed and silent, began to linger near the edges of the chamber, their masks tilted ever so slightly listening. And now and then, one would leave a note, or a relic, or a page of their own. But silence, when stirred, doesn't always settle. One evening, as the lanterns were being lit, a new steward arrived, draped in dark green instead of slate gray, with gold embroidery curling like thorns across his sleeves. His mask was iron, not wood. His name was whispered. Vainer, a senior arbiter of doctrine, one of the original enforcers of the council's oldest codes. His presence chilled the air. Wherever he walked, voices dimmed. Pages were quickly rolled. The firewood cracked more quietly. And behind him came others, stewards, in new colors. Some with gold combs pinned at their belts, some bearing measuring ribbons that gleamed like polished wire. They said nothing, but their watching was loud. That night, the reading vault was emptier. Some did not come. Others left early. Even Alder, usually so grounded, sat with hands still, his voice absent from the circle. Edmund saw it all. He did not call it fear. He called it pause, and he understood. It was the same pause his grandfather had taken that day in Glimmerglen, the breath drawn, before stepping forward, knowing you may not return the same. So he stood and began to read aloud, not just from the true codex, but from the earliest lines he had written as a boy, when all he had was a pouch of beard trimmings and a stubborn hope. When I was 10, I saw a law cut the face of a man I loved. I did not raise my hand. He did not raise my voice. But I raised a memory, and it raised me. The words settled like ash, and then Tom rose beside him, placing a hand on his staff. I remember my father's beard. I remember the day he shaved it for fear. I remember the ache that followed. His voice cracked. But I want to grow something again, even if it starts in silence. Marin followed, then Alder, and soon the vault was humming again, low, steady, unafraid. The next day, Vainer summoned Edmund alone, not to the council, but to the Gallery of Lapses, a cold, narrow corridor where etched stone bore the names of those who had once broken with law, philosophy, or faith, and vanished into obscurity. Some names were scratched out, others were incomplete. Some plaques had no name at all, only a symbol of shears lying beside a quill. Vainer stood at the far end, facing a blank wall. When law was first written, he said, voice like gravel beneath frost, it was meant to prevent collapse, not to define souls. Edmund said nothing. But when you give law a crown, it learns to demand worship. He turned. His eyes, when the iron mask lifted, were not cruel, just tired, and old, and full of something Edmund had not expected. Doubt. You have awoken something, Weaver, Vainer said. Something we cannot cut away with decree. He stepped forward. But know this, stone does not yield quickly, nor do those who guard it. He reached into his robe and withdrew a sealed parchment. Take this to the people, he said. It is not an endorsement, but it is permission. Edmund took it slowly. What does it say? That the council will allow one gathering, one voice, shared before witnesses, before judgment is made. Edmund's heart stirred. It will be held in the central vault in 3 nights, Boehner said. After that, the council will vote. And then he said the most unexpected thing of all. I hope you give them something they cannot forget. That night, Edmund returned to the vault, parchment in hand, and told the caravan what had passed. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only quiet nods, as if they all understood the weight of what was now before them. In 3 nights, they would not merely read, they would remember aloud, before those who had tried to bury memory. And if the council still voted to silence them, then the mountain would know and the people would know that it was not defiance being crushed, but truth. The vault had never been so quiet. The parchment from Boehner lay unfolded on the stone table in the center of the room, its gold seal cracked open like a shell. Marin read it 3 times, lips moving without sound. Ella sat beside her, arms crossed, face unreadable. Even Tom, who usually tapped his staff when nervous, was utterly still. Edmund stood near the lantern, his shadow long and flickering across the scroll-lined walls. 3 nights. That was all they had. By morning, word had already begun to ripple through the corridors of Almscliff, not from messengers or proclamations, but from glances, from footsteps too quick to be casual, from sudden silences when Edmund passed by. Someone left a comb of woven silver strands at the reading vault door. Another placed a strip of old parchment under a water jug, ink barely legible. I have waited 30 years for someone to speak aloud what I never could. In the kitchens, a steward handed Tom an extra loaf of honey bread, winked, and walked away without a word. And in one of the deeper tunnels, Alder found a mural that hadn't been there the day before, a simple line sketch of a bearded figure standing atop a hill of open scrolls, arms wide as if catching rain. Below it, written in charcoal, "If law is stone, let memory be the river." The caravan began preparing, not for war, but for telling. Each member would speak, not as rebels or philosophers, but as keepers of the living codex. Not just Edmund, not just the elders, but everyone who remembered something too precious to remain unspoken. We're not trying to change the law by force, Edmund told them. We're trying to remind the law who it was. They practiced their words under lantern light, their memories spilling like rivers onto shared parchment. Marin whispered a tale of her brother's first beard, burned by decree, when he refused to braid it in court-approved style. Alder described the ache in his hands the day he shaved without looking in the mirror. Even quiet Tom had a passage he wanted to speak short, direct, like him. I still talk to the braid, not because it hears me, but because I still need someone who knows. Edmund offered no corrections, no revisions. Each word, he said, was perfect because it was remembered. The night before the gathering, rain fell for the first time in weeks. Not outside, but inside. Moisture trickled from cracks in the old stone above the reading vault, forming soft rivulets along the floor. A rare thing, even for Almscliff, and taken by many as a sign. "The mountain weeps," said one steward with a faint smile. "Perhaps for the things it buried too deep." Edmund stayed awake late into the night, alone at the table, scrolls unrolled before him. The bronze badge of the Bristleborn Order lay at his side, catching the candlelight. He was not afraid. He was something older than fear. He was ready. In the final hour before rest, a visitor came, one he hadn't expected. Inspector Hallgren. Older now, hair grayer, posture stiffer, but still wrapped in his navy coat with golden buttons shaped like combs. He did not come with guards. He carried no scroll, only a weathered comb and a folded handkerchief. Edmund looked up, unsure whether to stand or remain seated. Hallgren spoke first. "I read your name today, on a wall I once signed with pride," he said quietly. "The law wall." Edmund nodded slowly. "And did it change how you see it?" Hallgren shrugged. "No, but it reminded me that even stone erodes given time." He placed the handkerchief on the table. Inside was a single braid, gray and thin, wrapped in twine. My father's, Halgren said. He kept it hidden all his life. Gave it to me on his deathbed and told me, I am sorry I ever told you to be smooth. He paused, then added, I will not speak for you tomorrow, but I will not oppose you either. Edmund exhaled. That, somehow, meant more than applause. And so, in the final hours before the turning, the caravan sat together, one last time, not rehearsing, not debating, just being. They shared a simple meal root stew, black bread, pears from Fenrest, and passed the true codex around the circle, each placing a thumbprint beside their name. Tom, smallest of all, pressed both thumbs. One for me, he whispered, and one for the braid. Laughter came quiet but real, then silence, not fearful, but full, as if every breath drawn now carried with it all the weight of the stories they'd gathered all the years of suppression, of remembering in secret, of letting the truth grow back inch by careful inch. Edmund stood last. He did not hold the scroll. He did not wear the badge. He held only the pouch. Inside, a grandfather's whiskers, a boy's first defiance, and the last braid of a lawkeeper's father. He looked around the room at the friends who had walked with him, sung beside him, believed with him. You've all given something, he said. Tomorrow, we don't ask for power. We don't demand surrender. We offer return to what was felt, to what was silenced, to what was once whispered and will now be heard. He raised the pouch. This is not relic. This is not rebellion. This is remembrance. And so, the candle was snuffed. The vault darkened, and the mountain, for a moment, seemed to breathe in, awaiting the dawn, awaiting the voice, awaiting the turning. At the first hour of light, the bell of Almscliff rang, not the usual cold chime that echoed like a blade drawn too slowly, but a deep, golden tone, soft as wool and resonant as thunder trapped in velvet. It rang only once, but once was enough. Throughout the mountain halls, doors opened. Sandals scuffed stone. Lanterns were relit. Stewards moved in slow, coordinated procession. Even those who had long since abandoned curiosity turned their ears to the sound, as if something ancient had been stirred, not summoned, but remembered. The gathering vault lay at the very heart of Almscliff, a chamber so old, no records told who carved it. Its walls curved upward like the inside of a seashell, and the ceiling bore a single wide opening that allowed morning light to pour in like milk into a bowl. It was said that once a year, on a particular day, the sun aligned perfectly above the vault and lit its center without shadow. This was that day, and in the center, waiting beneath the falling light, stood a single platform low, circular, made of wood darkened by centuries. It bore no decoration, only a groove in its center where once, long ago, a scroll had been unfurled and read. The original codex, perhaps. Now it was Edmund's turn. They entered together, Edmund at the front, Marin and Alder at his side, Tom just behind his staff newly polished, the small braid fluttering at its tip like a flag carried into peace rather than war. The hall was already half full. Stewards in rows of gray, council scribes, lore keepers, former trimmers, a few villagers from Glimmerglen, Penridge, even distant Loamrest, who had journeyed by cart or on foot when word somehow reached them. All sat in respectful stillness, not reverence, not resistance, but readiness. And at the very back of the room, behind a veil of woven silk, sat the council of measure, still faceless, still silent, but present. That alone was a shift in the stone. The gathering began not with speech, but with music. Alder, with hands that had once only shaped stone, raised a small wooden lyre, an old one, strung with sheepgut and patience. He played no melody that anyone recognized, and yet everyone somehow knew it. It was the tune the wind hummed through the beards of their ancestors. It was the rhythm of combs sliding through morning ritual. It was the lullaby sung in fear, and the song hummed in defiance. When the last note faded, Edmund stepped forward onto the wooden platform. He held no scroll, no badge, only the pouch. The hall seemed to breathe with him. He did not shout. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the stone, through the air, through the hearts of those who had waited a lifetime for something to break the silence. Before the law, there was a braid. Before the braid, there was a whisper. And before the whisper, there was a man who sat by the fire and let his beard grow while he told stories to a child. He opened the pouch and held it out. A hush fell so complete. Even the dust seemed to hover midair. This, he said, is not protest. This is a grandfather's memory, a promise, a cut that still sings. Use it trimmings, is a testament. He placed the pouch in the groove on the platform, then unrolled a fresh piece of parchment, not the old codex, but a new one, bearing the ink of dozens of hands. This is not law. Not yet. It is a request, a remembrance, a return. We ask, not that you erase the law, only that you let the people remember before they obey. Maan stepped forward next. She did not look at the council. She looked at the crowd. When I was 7, I watched my brother shave his beard with a broken shell. He bled for weeks, not because he wanted to, because he was told that if he braided it again, he'd lose his job, his joy, his voice. That's not order. That's silence wearing a crown. She bowed her head. Then Tom, hands shaking, voice small but sure. I still talk to the braid. I don't care if you think that's foolish, because when I do, I feel like someone listens. He placed his braid stick beside the pouch. Then Alder spoke. Then 3 others from the caravan. Then a steward from the edge of the crowd, his robe clean, his hands trembling, stepped forward and said, I, too, remember. By the time Edmund raised his eyes again, the vault was not quiet. It was holding its breath, not from fear, from something else, from something turning. He stepped back, off the platform. The light had reached its apex, bathing the platform in gold. And then the council spoke, not in fragments, not in questions, but in one single voice, shared by many mouths. The law is strong, but strength is not stubbornness. We have heard the memory. We shall weigh it. And before the sun sets, we shall decide whether the mountain must bend. They fell silent, and the light began to shift. Edmund did not speak again. He returned to his place beside his companions. Their hands joined in wordless unity. The gathering was over, but something greater had just begun. The ember had not just glowed, it had spoken. And now, the mountain would answer. The vault emptied slowly, not like a crowd dispersing, but like a tide receding, gentle, unsure, as if even those who rose from their seats weren't certain if they were leaving a place or stepping into something entirely new. No one spoke above a whisper. No one laughed. Many simply walked in silence, their hands folded, their eyes distant. But what they carried wasn't fear. It was weight, the weight of words still echoing in their bones, of truths that had stirred beneath their ribs and found no place to return. Edmund watched them go, still, on the edge of the platform, his heart quiet but pulsing with something deep and ancient, the slow rhythm of a mountain beginning to shift. The council had withdrawn, vanished behind the veil. The silk curtain trembled once, then stilled. Now, as the sunlight drifted across the floor like spilled honey, the vault stood waiting. The light's center had passed the platform, slanting now toward the east wall, marking the descent of afternoon. Marin approached Edmund without a word. She didn't ask how he felt, didn't offer congratulations or comfort. She simply stood beside him. Sometimes, that's all memory needs. In a smaller chamber, carved just beyond the vault, the caravan gathered again. Edmund, Marin, Alder, Tom, and the others, seated on woven mats around a single candle. They didn't speak of the council's reaction, because there had been none. They didn't guess at the outcome, because they couldn't. What they did speak of were stories. Alder shared how his father, once a stonemason of the eastern ridges, had carved combs from discarded rock and passed them to travelers as talismans. Marin told of her grandmother, who used to keep a hidden ledger filled not with numbers but with names of every man and woman fined for facial hair that didn't conform. Even Tom, wide-eyed and soft-voiced, shared a memory of sitting in a field and listening to the wind whistle through the orchard and how it always sounded like braids humming to one another. Each tale braided into the next, each pause between them filled not with silence, but trust. Outside, the sun slid lower. The light in the vault crept toward the stone steps. Still, no bell rang. Still, no steward came. Attention rose, not panic, but stillness drawn too tight. Edmund could feel it in his chest. Not dread. Something older than dread. The feeling of standing at the lip of a cliff, knowing the ground will not fall, but not knowing where you will land when you step forward. Then came a knock. Not urgent, not ceremonial, just a knock. And behind the door stood a child. A girl perhaps 9 in a wool cloak much too big for her hands smudged with charcoal. In her palm, she held a small wooden disc, burned with a symbol. A braid wrapped around a bell. Edmund knelt. "Who sent you?" She shook her head. "No one. I wanted to say thank you." She opened her other hand, revealing a handful of shorn whiskers. "My brother was made to shave yesterday," he cried, "so I saved these." Her voice wavered. "Do you think he'll grow it back?" Edmund looked at the whiskers, black and gold and soft as sorrow. "I think he already is," he said. She nodded and slipped the braid bell disc into his hand. "I drew it this morning," she whispered, before the light hit the floor. And then she left, as suddenly as she had come. Twilight approached. In Almscliff, lamps were lit with oil from pressed lavender seeds. Along the vaulted corridors, stewards moved once more, but not with measuring tapes or proclamations. They carried empty scrolls and combs of metal, wood, bone, and clay, some old, some broken, some made that very day. They were laid along the edge of the gathering vault, not as weapons, not as symbols of defiance, but as offerings, as if each steward had searched their past for one thing that still remembered. Finally, the bell rang, not once, but twice, low, steady, and from behind the veil, 6 stewards stepped forward, one for each voice of the council, though the council itself remained unseen. They held a single scroll, sealed with both wax and a pressed braid mark. The seal was split in 2 parts, one golden, one gray. They placed the scroll upon the groove in the platform where Edmund's pouch still rested, and one steward, an elder woman with trembling hands, began to read. "Let it be known, the law of beard measurement, known as Edict 27b, shall not be erased, for it bears the weight of history and caution. But let it also be known, the law shall no longer bind the face of the people without first hearing their voice. Every village, town, and province shall henceforth be permitted to gather once a season, to speak memory aloud, to shape their own customs around hair, heritage, and the truths they choose to keep. Let the people not be ruled by measurement, but by meaning. Let the codex not be buried. Let it be rewritten." The vault held its breath. Then, applause did not erupt. No one cheered. Instead, there was a sound more sacred. The sound of dozens weeping. The sound of beards being touched with reverence. The sound of paper unfolding. And somewhere in the back, a small, cracked voice began to sing the braid song. And another joined. And another. Until once again, the vault hummed. Marin took Edmund's hand. Tom touched the pouch. Alder, always stoic, wept openly, not with sorrow, but with a release generations in the making. Edmund stepped forward, not to speak, but to kneel. He did not thank the council. He thanked the mountain, because now it remembered too. News spreads differently when it carries memory. It doesn't gallop like a horse or shout like a herald. It drifts, it settles, it echoes. And so the decree of Almscliff did not reach the outer villages in waves of fanfare or banners, but in the soft voices of travelers and tradesfolk who whispered, "It's true, they've listened." In Glimmerglen, a baker folded the morning dough more slowly, remembering the boy with the scroll and the beard that had once trailed like a dream. In Penridge, someone tied a green and gold ribbon to the statue in the square and left a tin comb beside it, polished and shining. And in the lavender-swept fields of Loamrest, a group of children gathered around Vera and June, who sat beneath the old willow and read aloud from a new scroll. Let the village choose, let the memory guide, let the face reflect the spirit, not the fear. The children didn't fully understand, but they listened anyway, because the way a story is told matters, and they could feel, even in their bones, that something had changed. Back in Almscliff, Edmund stood at the edge of the cliff path, where it all began just beyond the Gate of Echoes, where Law once carved names like brands into stone. Now, a new symbol had been added, etched in softer curves just above the entrance, a circle of braids wrapped around an empty scroll. Beneath it, in modest script, the voice before the measure. He traced it with his fingers. It wasn't his doing. He suspected it had been carved by one of the stewards, perhaps one who never spoke, but had listened longer than anyone realized. The caravan did not disband, but it changed. No longer a traveling rebellion, no longer a whisper of defiance now. They were keepers. Keepers of the true codex, yes, but also of something harder to hold. The right to feel, to remember, to honor the quiet rituals that once risked punishment. They began journeying again not as shadows, but as guests, invited by towns across Velhart to sit in the circle and listen. The gatherings were called braiding evenings. No one was required to speak. No one was told how long or short their beard should be. But a candle was lit, and a comb was passed, and those who wished to share a memory, a melody, a silence, did so. And when they finished, they tied a ribbon to the branch of the nearest tree, as if to say, "We were here. We remembered." At the second gathering in Fenrest, a young man approached Edmund afterward with tears in his eyes. He had no beard, no braid, not even stubble. He looked almost ashamed. "I have no story like yours," he said. Edmund smiled. "Then tell the one you do have." The young man looked down. "When I was little, I wanted to grow a beard, but my mother always said it would make me look like the man who left us." He paused. "So I never tried. I thought maybe that made me weak." Edmund's voice was gentle. "But you're here." The young man nodded. "And for the first time, I think I want to grow, even if it's slow." Edmund didn't offer advice. He simply handed him a small vial of oil and whispered, "The slowest roots dig deepest." As seasons shifted, the scroll grew longer not just from the caravan, but from every corner of the kingdom. Villages began sending pages of their own, not petitions, not complaints, but additions. A song from the far western isles about braiding wind into hair. A dance from the southern hills that honored beard shedding during grief. A ritual from the northern cliffs where ashes of a past elder's beard were scattered into the sea with lavender. Edmund no longer wrote alone. He merely wove, threading together the lives of a people rediscovering that identity was not uniform. It was layered, like a braid, like a forest, like memory itself. One autumn morning, Marin found Edmund sitting by a river, gazing into the water with that distant look he sometimes wore half peace, half ache. She sat beside him. "You haven't spoken of your grandfather in some time," she said gently. Edmund nodded. "I've been thinking about the day they cut his beard." He glanced at the ripples, then added, "For a long time, I thought that was the moment everything ended." He reached into his cloak and pulled out the pouch, now older. "Its seams mended in 3 different colors of thread. But now I think maybe that was the moment everything began." He untied the strings and poured the contents into his palm. Strands of gray and chestnut, time-softened and smelling faintly of pine and lavender. He held them over the water, and with a quiet breath, released them. They drifted out across the current, caught in sunlight, tiny silver threads, dancing on the ripples like stardust learning to float. Marin said nothing, but she reached into her satchel and pulled out a new pouch, empty, soft, stitched with green and gold. She handed it to him. "For the next beard," she said. And so, in the fading golden light of another day remembered, Edmund Weaver closed his eyes and smiled. The ember still glowed, but now it had caught, and across the land, in hearths and halls and hearts long silenced, the fire of memory had begun to warm the world again. Years passed, not with fanfare or banners, but in the quiet way trees grow steady, slow, unseen, until suddenly they are everywhere, shading paths that once burned in sun. The kingdom of Velhart changed, not by decree, but by custom. The law of beard measurement remained in the great books, as history often insists, but its enforcement withered. Inspectors retrained as lorekeepers. Beard courts became story halls. Even the Council of Measure, once faceless, voiceless, unmoving, held annual sessions open to the people, where memory was presented before law. And in every village, from the misty edges of the Stonewood to the cliffs of Almscliff, people began to ask not, "How long is your beard?" but rather, "What story does it carry?" In Glimmerglen, where it all began, a statue was raised in the town square. It was not of Edmund Weaver. He had insisted upon that. Instead, it showed an old man in a wooden chair beside a fire, a boy at his feet, listening wide-eyed as strands of beard coiled like river mist around them both. At the base were carved simple words, "Let the telling grow." Edmund never returned to the center of power, not as a ruler, not as a judge. He wandered. He listened, in taverns and fields, beside forges and under orchard trees. He met strangers who had never heard his name, but had heard a story of a pouch of whiskers, of a scroll written by many hands, of a boy who once asked if a beard could carry a dream. He smiled at those moments, not out of pride, but because it meant the tale was no longer his. It belonged to them now. He settled in a small valley near the whispering river of Lenmore, where moss blanketed every rock and spring water tasted of mint and stone. A cottage, modest and warm, a garden full of rosemary and thyme, and a room filled with scrolls, not sealed scrolls, open ones, pages still being written. He taught children there, not from books but from experience. He showed them how to braid stories into hair, how to mix beard oil with nettle and kindness, how to measure not with rulers but with heart. And each evening, they would sit by the hearth just as he once had, and he would begin. Once, in a time not as far away as it seems, there lived a people who forgot to remember. The children would lean in, and the ember would glow. One autumn, when the leaves had gone golden, and the sky tasted of cold, Edmund sat beneath the pear tree behind his cottage, eyes half closed, a new pouch in his hands. It was full now, of whiskers from those who had joined the caravan after him, of strands given in trust, of tokens sent by strangers who only signed their letters, "Remember me." He tied it closed, kissed it once, and placed it in a small wooden box, beside three others, one his grandfather's, one his own from Glimmerglen, and one made the day the true codex was sealed. He locked the box, placed it on a high shelf, and wrote beside it, "To be opened only when silence grows loud again." He did not fade with thunder. There was no great ceremony, only the turning of seasons, the soft folding of hands, and the wind that passed through the valley like a sigh filled with lullabies. When he no longer rose at dawn, Marin came. She, older now too, stood at his bedside and smiled. "You always said the ember wasn't meant to burn everything," she whispered. "Just enough to warm the next soul." She took the scroll that lay beside him open, unfinished, ink still drying on the last line. "What matters most is not how loud the story is told, but how gently it's carried." She pressed her lips to the parchment and rolled it with care. Outside, the children were already lighting the evening lanterns, and the wind, old, kind, wild, began to stir the trees. Many years later, a young girl, no more than 7, crept into the small stone library in Lenmore. She was chasing a moth not to catch it, just to see how long it would let her follow. The door was open, as it always had been. Dust danced in golden slants across shelves, and beneath a glass case lay 4 pouches, different sizes, different colors, all resting together. Beside them, a scroll. She couldn't read it all, but she recognized one line, repeated across the top. Let the telling grow. She turned. Behind her stood an old woman, tall, strong, smiling with her eyes. Would you like to hear the story? The woman asked. The girl nodded. Then bring a comb, the woman said. And your voice. That's all you need. The girl ran off, and a moment later, the bell of the hearth sounded 3 soft notes. Not a call to arms, not a call to judgment, just the beginning of a story, one that would grow again, quietly, bravely, endlessly, just like a beard. And so, dear listener, as the final embers of our story flicker into the quiet of night, we close the scroll on the tale of the measured beard, a tale not of swords or thrones, but of memory, of quiet courage, and of a boy who believed that even the smallest story, when carried with love, can shape the world. Edmund Weaver didn't shout. He didn't conquer. He simply remembered, and in doing so, he helped a kingdom remember itself, one whisper, one beard, one gentle truth at a time. Perhaps, in your own way, you've carried memories, 2 things long buried beneath routine or fear, waiting for someone, maybe just like you, to open the pouch, hold them to the light, and say, this still matters. So as you settle in tonight, let this story be a soft reminder that your voice has value, that even quiet dreams can glow, and that sometimes all it takes to change the world is to listen, remember, and let something grow again. Thank you so much for spending your time here, and for allowing this gentle story to keep you company as you rest. If you enjoyed this tale, I warmly invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so you'll always have a place to return to when the world feels too loud. Now, may your dreams be peaceful, your heart be light, and your night be filled with calm. Sleep well. You are safe. Good night.